Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Psyche-pathology and Well-being. This is on the Cognitive Science Show, and I'm here again with Gregg Enriquez and Garri Ovanesian. And I'm going to turn things over to Garri since he helmed the last episode, and we're going to continue on. But first, I'll just let Gregg and Garri say hello.
Hey, I thought that last week was really very interesting, and I'd like folks to pay attention. The last three Voices of Vervaeke episodes, the first was Scott Jordan on wild systems, and then Rich Blundell and his big history into ecological intelligence and the embodiment of that, and then Mark Miller's work on well-being and predictive processing. Have enormous overlap and are really indicative of a convergent validity, kairotic moment, I think, in relationship to where we are in some of the transformations in our fundamental understanding of natural science into cognitive science, psychology, that situates actually a coherent ontology. And it's super exciting. So I'm pumped about that. Thank you, John, for all your brilliant work.
Thank you, Gregg.
Yeah, thanks, John and Gregg. So what I want to start with actually is just a little recap of last time to sort of identify where exactly we're positioned on this path to articulating a kind of psyche-pathology and account of well-being, and then to continue on that path and lay out some next steps for us to take. So essentially, the core theme of our discussions has been organized around trying to understand what the transjective space between self and world is about, especially as it concerns the problem of well-being and psyche-pathology. So last time I started making the argument that at the core of many of the normativities that psychologists care about, especially when considered from the personality theory perspective, we find recursive relevance realization taking place. Mm-hmm. In other words, I propose that RRR stands as a criterion of the normative for psychology, or at least the psychologies that we're considering here. So, which is not to say that we wouldn't make at some point the argument that RRR would count as the normative for psychology in general, but that's not the argument that I'm making right now. Though I think that is something we would probably agree on, all three of us here. So I suggested that, and we went over some of the recent work that John and I published together on enactivist Big Five theory, which essentially made the claim that individual differences in personality are essentially differences in styles of optimal gripping. Mm-hmm. And we extended that and made the claim, a kind of phenomenological elaboration of EB5T that said that individual differences in personality traits are essentially individual differences in styles of world enactment. Mm-hmm. That's sort of where the conversation ended last time. Mm-hmm. And along the way, I guess I'll echo this again and sort of give it a more clear sense of shape, I suppose, that from the EB5T perspective, there's 5 normativities that we can get a sense of, each one pertaining to each of the traits that's being measured by the 5-factor model. So I just want to cover those quickly and make a few comments about the general state that we were left in, and then we'll take it from there. So trait conscientiousness, we suggested, again, building off of Colin de Young's work on cybernetic Big Five theory and weaving it into enactivism through enactivist Big Five theory, that the function, so to speak, of trait conscientiousness is to, right? Conscientiousness is a kind of adaptation to the problem of ordering and planning, to the problem of prioritizing goals across various timescales. Do I prioritize what's relevant to me and to life in the future, or do I prioritize what's relevant to me in the here and now? What comes first, or what should come first? And individual differences along this dimension are predictive of how people tend to prioritize future versus present goals, let's say. Next, trait neuroticism is an adaptation to the problem of threat, such that people who are higher in trait neuroticism, they tend to be more sensitively attuned to the potentially threatening aspects of the unknown as they confront it. Whereas people who are lower in trait conscientiousness tend to be relatively less sensitive to the potentially threatening aspects of trait conscientiousness, as a consequence of which they tend to experience anxiety, depression, and moodiness less frequently than those who are higher on the trait. Next, trait openness. We suggested that it's an adaptation to the problem of something like cognitive framing. The higher you are in trait openness, the more exploratory your style of considering information and semantic possibilities tends to be, which basically means that when you see two dots and you have to connect them, you're going to explore all the different pathways, right, to connecting the two dots rather than just drawing a straight line, which is what somebody who's lower on trait conscientiousness would tend to do.
Openness.
Openness. Thank you for that. That was an interesting slip. I'll take it up with my analyst later. So next we have trait extraversion, which we suggested is an adaptation to the problem of reward. In other words, people who are higher in trait conscientiousness, they tend to be more sensitively attuned to the incentive reward value of the unknown.
Trait extraversion. I think conscientiousness snuck in there again, perhaps. But anyway,
okay.
We know we're on extroversion.
You know what? This isn't a psychoanalytic problem. It's a lack of caffeine problem.
Right. Right. Well, you either go neurocognitive or psychoanalytic, right?
So interesting. Both conscientiousness and caffeine start with a C. So maybe there's some connection on the letter.
That's obviously the connection.
So, okay. So with trait extraversion, people who are higher on trait extraversion, they tend to appear and present as more enthusiastic, excitable, opportunistic. When when they hear that there's a party going on next door, they're going to get excited at the possibilities of meeting strangers and building new relationships. Whereas people who are lower in that trait will tend to be more indifferent to the incentive reward value inherent in the unknown. And finally, trait agreeableness, which we discussed, and we so the initial argument in EB5T, at least, that we made, John and I, was that agreeableness is an adaptation to the problem of prioritizing self versus other goals. Now, based on how our conversation went last time, the normativity of agreeableness was left in a kind of semi-certain state. And if I recall correctly, the claim that we ended up making, or the question that we ended up opening, was about the connection between trait agreeableness as an adaptation and the problem of like social cognition or intersubjectivity. It was something like that, the way I remember it. If you want to fill in the blanks or add something to that, please do so.
Yeah, I mean, all I was doing was I was just dropping this analysis into the UTOC structure, especially as it pertains to character adaptations and the evolution of our cognitive consciousness functions, okay, over time. When I do that, the traits organize themselves pretty clearly. They organize themselves at the animal layer, where you get an extroverted, neurotic, positive affect, negative affect dialectic. You drum up at a person layer, you can see conscientiousness and openness. If we're looking through the stability plasticity lens, those dialectical structures become immediately apparent to you. And all I was saying was, if I look at the primate layer, heart layer, with the influence matrix, you see clearly what agreeableness is trying to get at, which is exactly the relationship of self-other, okay? And yes, it is the case that a somewhat more conservative approach is to sort of amend yourself to the order of the social world, and therefore agreeableness would lean in relationship to stability. However, the layering of self-other dynamics embedded in this entire trait doesn't yield exactly the same kind of stability plasticity dialectic as extroversion and neuroticism relative to conscientiousness and openness does. There's a whole nother layer of self-other dynamic iterative process, and it really gets at the other over self dynamic, is what agreeableness does. And there's other stability plasticity dynamics that would need to be teased apart in that dimension. And then, so it won't quite map as clearly on the meta traits as these others do. according for a Utah perspective.
Excellent. So what I want to do then is just bracket that temporarily, because the argument I think I'm going to want to make is going to suggest that the kind of optimal gripping dynamic between efficiency and resiliency, or when considered from the trade perspective between stability and plasticity, shows up in trade agreeableness when considered from the point of view of attachment. That's the connection I will want to make, I think. So for now, I suppose we can say that we have more or less the normativities of 4 of the traits down. And the last one, agreeableness, is sort of a question mark, but we'll get to that afterwards.
Great.
Well, I mean, it's a bounded question. We know it has something to do with self-other relation, but we also talked about that it might also have something to do with interface between individual and distributed cognition, which isn't the same map as self-other. They're related, but they're not the same. And that's what I think I proposed last time. If we put those two similar, overlapping, but not identical dimensions in, we'll get some of the variants that Gregg is pointing to. That's what I proposed.
Right. So there's a number of layerings that are operative here. So the cognitive angle, and this I would then, again, phylogenetically go to Tomasello's work. Tomasello's work is going to then show us as hominids creating an opportunity for intersubjective collective perspectival taking that is better than other apes. And that's going to create a collective intelligence kind of intersubjective dynamic, ultimately giving rise to justification. This is Vygotsky analyses in relation to affording us the capacity to network a collective intelligence. And that is going to play another role. So there are a lot of layers, I think, that need to be disentangled myself. But anyway, but yeah, and I'm really excited about doing the attachment thing. The influence matrix assimilates, according to its frame, 2 huge theories. One is attachment theory and the intersubjective, the circumplex model of Leary. And essentially the argument is that in other social animals, these things are fairly distributed across different modules of relational interaction. And with the hominid structure and our need for intersubjective collective intelligence coordination, these things get fused into a much more effective self-other fielding process. But anyway, those are all stuff we get into, and attachment theory is going to be very useful in making that bridge.
Yeah.
Okay, so
if I could just say one more thing about that is, yeah, I think there's a difference between the self-other relation at sort of the biological animal level and the individual distributed cognition that shows up on the cultural level. They overlap, but they're not the same. And
exactly.
Right.
So, and the last thing I'll just say then is there's a bridging function where we're at the animal, mammal into grade 8 primate, then humans through Tomasello's work fuse self-other cognition and doing things like dance and hunter-gatherer activities to manage a mammoth.
Yeah.
And then that affords symbolic networking, and then finally symbolic syntactical networking, giving rise to propositional speech, the problem of justification, and then the explosion of justificatory knowledge, which fundamentally is collective and distributed through dialogos.
Yeah.
Amazing.
That's excellent. That's very good.
I think the cultural level comes with its own kind of normativity.
Yes.
That's
Very,
that's
the point.
And slippery to like pin down, at least from my point of view and my understanding.
We have to be very careful about distinguishing social animality from person level cultural participation. Those are, one affords the other, and there's continuity between them, but there's also important differences. And what I'm seeing emerging in our dialogue about this, our dialogos about this, is agreeableness is this thing that is mediating exactly that point of continuity.
I would say, I would want to add conscientiousness to that bit as well, actually. I think, at least when it comes to human beings, as a necessary point, because to be able to coordinate oneself in relation to a group, as a cultural entity, that requires a degree of conscientiousness, which if missing, you see this in people, that they tend to struggle sort of, I mean, this is the Freudian metaphor, right, of keeping your shit together, right? Which totally. Essentially means that you neglect and forget about social norms and what's right, what's wrong. You sort of shit over the law. That's the law in the psychological sense. And so I think there's also a relationship to be found between agreeableness and conscientiousness as it pertains to our relationship to culture.
Totally.
Yes.
Yep.
I think that's right. So let's pick up your argument, Garri, about well, our argument, I guess, extending this into attachment theory.
Okay, so actually, before we do that, I was really hoping to make a point of connection with Gregg's project. Actually,
Right,
the
right.
entire right, bridging the enlightenment gap between, let's say, psychology on the one hand, right, as a third-person science of the mind, and the psyche as a first-person ideographic
Right.
locus of intelligent awareness and relationship to the world, something like that.
Perfect.
And I'd really like to do that with the Big Five theory, actually.
Okay.
So what I've done is I've prepared a little vignette for us to go over together that I think exemplifies a way of doing this.
Okay.
And so the problem really is that if you take a Big Five test, either online or in a clinic or whatnot, what it does is it crunches out certain numbers, which essentially place you somewhere on a bell curve, where you, right, your trait level or your trait measure is telling you where you stand relative to other people who've taken the test on that trait. So if you score, let's say, like the 57th percentile on trait conscientiousness, what that means is that based on how you responded, you're more conscientious than 57% of people who've taken the test. It's something like that. That's the logic of that. And so then these reports generally produce these very general descriptions of what this means about you. And they tend to focus on measures that lie on the extremities of on the tail ends of the bell curve, let's say. So the problem with that is you get a kind of classification of the type of personality you have from the trait perspective, which gives you these general descriptions of how you're likely to be and how you're likely to behave, think, feel, et cetera, but it doesn't really say anything specific about your idiosyncratic being in the world. That hermeneutic leap is not made, and it's left to the reader, to the participant, let's say, to make these connections, or to the clinician to help to make that leap. But there's a way of individualizing these kinds of statistical normative findings, normative in this statistical sense. Essentially what I've been experimenting with is applying a process of individualizing assessment findings in the nomothetic sense to the idiosyncratic conditions of being with participants in the here and now, something like that. Yep. So the vignette goes something like this. And by the way, if this is done successfully, then what you in effect end up doing or end up having done is bridging the third personal nomothetic statistical generality point of view, right? Yep. The third personal facts about the person, let's say, with the first personal experiences that they have, without reducing one to the other, which is essentially what the enactive approach is about. What and also what Gregg's approach of bridging psyche with psychology is trying to do as well. The behavioral phenomenology that we talked about last time.
Lovely. I'll make one little additional discrimination here, and that is actually the traits are not only third person, but they're third person variable aggregate clouds. Okay, a variable aggregate cloud means you abstract the patterns and see them in the analysis of variance. And then you utilize variable aggregate clouds to track then individual level behavior. So it's actually, there's two jumps. There's one from variable aggregate clouds at the behavioral level to the Skinnerian N of one from the outside in behavioral level, okay? So there's actually two behavioral jumps, like Skinner hated analysis of variance, if you know Skinner. It's all N of one. So he's actually outside in N of one, watching the selection of variation, selection, retention of behavior from the outside and the environmental control variables that are absolutely idiographic in many ways. So I want to just make it clear that you can actually do behavioral idiographics from like a Skinnerian perspective, which is, or a personal perspective, which is slightly different than what much of psychology became through its statistical analysis, which is variable aggregate clouding. Okay. And so those two jumps, and then there's the psyche from the epistemic inside out, and then John's recursive relevance realization, which is inner Skinner and outer Skinner stitched together brilliantly.
That's
I
an
love
interesting. I just got sort of a horrific image in my mind, but yeah.
I'm sorry, right? It's the Frankenstein.
No, it's well said.
But it's actually brilliant in my estimation.
That's really funny.
You did. So
That's
anyway,
really funny.
but yes, all of that. I just want to say, that down. One way of thinking about it, we as clinicians have always been relating to the idiographic, but from the outside in. We can never directly relate inside out. We use our empathy to do that.
Right. Okay. So that being said, I would say that the end goal, let's say, of the kinds of reports that the individualized approach to the assessment tries to generate is to bridge the outside in and inside out perspectives.
Yep.
So, relevance realization obviously will factor into that. And maybe we can discuss this actually through the vignette. So the patient that I have in mind looks something like this. They come to the clinic room and their presenting concern is that they've been experiencing a lot of anxiety and even panic in the last 3 or 4 months. Some sort of background information on the patient, this hypothetical entity. They just graduated from college, where they lived on campus for about 4 years away from home. So now they're back home for the first time in 4 years with family. They're looking for employment, but they majored in a kind of art discipline. So stable opportunities aren't really there. So
I've never heard of a case like this.
I know, right? So, they've got a relationship that's been going for about 3-4 years, but the future of that is uncertain. And a few other examples from their hypothetical lived experience is that whenever they're driving on the road and there's a lot of traffic, they tend to get very anxious because there's a lot of moving targets to track at once. Or when in the part-time opportunities that they've managed to secure for themselves, their boss gives them or assigns tasks that they're not already familiar with and lack the sufficient expertise for. They, again, tend to get anxious because there's a lot to sort of manage that's unknown. Okay, the question is, where is my anxiety coming from and how can I better manage it? So I go ahead and do a big 5 with the patient. And it turns out that their scores are as follows. Trade conscientiousness, 92nd percentile. Trade openness, 94th percentile. Trade neuroticism, 87th percentile. Trade agreeableness, 12th percentile. And trade extraversion, 15th percentile. Now, how do I make sense of this? So before I go on, do you guys have any thoughts or impressions so far? What's this like for you? I'm curious.
I'm not sure what you're asking. I mean, this seems plausible to me. Is that what you're asking, or?
Yeah, just like what kinds of connections, if any, you're starting to make or think of. Maybe we can discuss a little bit, unless you'd like me to keep going.
Well, what's occurring to me is I'm thinking that there might be another trade-off relationship that's needed in the recursive relevance realization model between sort of updating the model using some predictive processing language, which is an internally focused strategy, or changing the world, which is externally focused, and that you want to optimally grip between those two in some fashion. That was actually coming up because of the vignette. The idea that I think there's another important trade-off relationship, and I think, right, and there's 2 different strategies, right? You can't, right? And of course, these map roughly onto assimilation and accommodation strategies, but there's an internal and an external version of them. Because when you, right, when the model accommodates, you assimilate to the world, and when you change the world, right, then you're assimilating to the model. So there's a weird inverse relationship between assimilation and accommodation inside and outside, which is really interesting because I've often thought that affordances actually have that kind of inverted relationship between virtual engines inside and out. That was what was in my mind, actually.
So is the implication there that from the predictive processing point of view, assimilation is when you act to change your predictions, whereas accommodation would be—
No. What I'm saying is there's both an internal and an external version. So I can accommodate the model by changing it. And what I'm then doing is assimilating to the world. Or I can accommodate, I can do accommodation on the world. I can make the world accommodate me, right? And I can change, which means then the world is being made to assimilate to my model. And so it's like this, like they're inverted with respect to each other, right? Assimilation, accommodation, tensions within the model, and assimilation and accommodation. And I've been sort of working on an idea that a way of specifying affordances in terms of that inverse relationship between internal virtual engines and external virtual engines. And this is probably getting us too theoretically far away from the field, but this is what, right, I'm trying to understand, right, that there's ways in which internal and external virtual engines fit together in this inverted relationship, and that's constitutive of affordances emerging for us. So that's what was occurring to me.
No, that's really interesting, because I wonder how this adds up to the phenomenology of this hypothetical patient.
Because I don't know. What I was trying to do was also think of a way of getting various aspects of what Gregg was saying to fit together, right? And to somehow prioritize transjectivity. One of the things I guess I would want to ask the patient, and this is not the same thing as the introversion, extroversion, I don't think. It's more about where are the strategies of amelioration? What are they doing? Are they concentrating more on updating the model, sort of a stoic approach, or are they concentrating more on changing the world, sort of a romantic approach, right? I'm going to impose my will on the world.
It's the latter in this hypothetical case.
That's
very much the latter. Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's how I hear it. Very similar, although it's going to come from a sort of different frame, but the nuanced transjective aspects of self-modeling, world modeling are very much available if you know how to make the transition. So for me, the basic issue is here you have somebody in a life developmental stage into transitioning from young adulthood to adulthood. And with high openness, high conscientiousness, that actually places a lot of demands. It's actually hard to navigate high openness, high conscientiousness.
Yeah.
I'm actually very fortunate. I'm very high on both, and I can afford myself through my work that capacity. But actually, you do have to navigate the demands. Think about them as trade-off. To achieve both is not easy.
Yeah.
Right? So then you have to somebody who also has high disagreeable, high neuroticism. Okay, this is actually then going to create certain kinds of structural dynamics in the ways in which they manage threat, react to threat, and create interpersonal spaces. So you want high achievement, you want to do well, you want to do all this other stuff, yet you're irritable, okay, and tend to be somewhat self-focused, and you want to then control stuff, and you're then reactive in a particular kind of way. And if you then have all of these standards and you put these kinds of pressures on yourself, and you want to both be an artist and really successful at the same time, and then all of a sudden you're difficult in this society, geez, how do you actually really succeed? The numbers of people actually able to find that place in society and flourish, yet you're going to have very high standards, be critical of self and others, and be reactive, and not necessarily have the affordance of reward seeking that would enable you to kind of know when to differentiate. Now, all of a sudden, you're really vulnerable to getting trapped. If shit starts going wrong, all of a sudden you start reacting, right? And then you start constricting, and now you're bitter at self and other in relation, and the entire world's a threat. So you're just swimming in anxiety.
I love that.
that was a moment of virtuosity, Gregg. That was really impressive. That was really impressive.
Anyway, this is what I do clinically. So that's where I come from in terms of just.
No, I love that. That is the process of bridging the nomothetic with the idiographic, coming from the outside in, basically. And it's really interesting how looking at a set of numbers can tell you so much about a person if you know how to interpret them, if you know how to make sense of them. And really, Gregg, that was spot on. Not that I know anything about this hypothetical patient or anything like that, but if we try to translate this into enactivist and phenomenological terms, what we need to do is sort of articulate a set of styles that apply to this person as a person based on their big five measures. And so you can imagine how, again, to sort of echo a lot of what Gregg already said, being high in trait neuroticism means that you're keenly aware and sensitive to the negative possibilities that arise in uncertain situations. So when you're confronted with the unknown, you enact it as a terrible thing. When the future becomes unknown, you're enacting the future as terrible and something to be afraid of, something to be threatened by. Now, then comes in trait conscientiousness, which is, right, the demand to, right, structure and order experience. And so when something goes wrong for this patient, which is pretty much any time when something unpredictable happens, right, there's a strong impulse to come in and control and manage the uncertainty that arises. And so when the future becomes unknown, right, it's not only enacted as a kind of terrible, fearful, threatening thing that's about to happen and unfold, but something to be managed and controlled. Now comes in trait openness. Man, your neuroticism, so you see the bad possibilities, low on trait extraversion, so you don't really see the opportunities. If you're high on openness, then you're going to take the negative and amplify it. And when there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of bad stuff happening, right? And your creativity and imagination, which typically help you to solve problems, right, in original ways, in effective, outside of the box ways, that's now working against you, because now the future is being enacted as a terrible sea of chaos that you have to try to contain in a little bottle, let's say, to invoke these kinds of metaphors.
Sure.
Then comes trait agreeableness. Being so low on trait agreeableness essentially means that in light of the unknown, when this person is faced with the unknown, they enact others as unreliable people, right? As unreliable entities to draw on. And so they end up enacting their own selves as pretty much omnipotent, with the pretense that they can do it all on their own. There's a kind of hyper individualism in place, in some sense. And you can imagine how in situations where the unknown is irreducible, like during major life transitions, right, such as the one that this hypothetical patient was going through, then the very strategies that tend to be there to help the person manage everything that is going on prove insufficient, horribly insufficient, and they're just drowning. And so panic and anxiety become virtually inevitable consequences.
Yep.
So we sort of took that and
by the way, if that goes on long enough, that will burn itself out into a depressive shutdown mode a lot of the time. So then you go from the anxiety, which is spending energy to try to escape, and eventually once you get so dead-ended, the affective system will shift from that you're already screwed, you're dead-ended, there's no way out of the cage, as it were, and it will then drop some of the activity and then shift you from anxiety to depression. Anxiety disorders precede depression disorders about 5 times as often as the reverse. And that's why, because the system burns itself out and then it starts shutting down.
So what I see the two of you doing, and what I see, what I didn't do is, of course, I was staying in sort of the nomological dimension. And what I saw both of you do was move from the nomological dimension to the historical. So you went from causal laws to causal pathways.
Yes.
And so, and of course, they're not identical and they can't be made identical. What is intriguing to me, I'm trying to use my words very carefully here, is how readily we can make that move and how well both of you did it. And yet trying to explain how you do it seems very problematic to me. Like what I mean is I'm wrestling with, how do you know when you're making the translation from law to history well, and how do you know when you're doing it poorly? And what was interesting to me is you both gelled and, you know,
We converged.
like,
Yep.
right. You converged, and it's like, so I don't want to be too much on the methodology, but I want to slow down here a little bit and zero in on what's going on in that, because I've thought a lot about this, how human beings move from laws to pathways and back and forth, and they do it fairly seamlessly, and they can do it at levels of expertise. Both of you are showing levels of expertise, and Gregg is showing tremendous level of expertise. That's readily apparent.
Well,
but
I mean, I'll just say the intersection of the laws of the lifespan developmental pathways and the phenomenological experience of being to get coherence coordinating that is the task of a skilled conceptualizer, in my estimation, in the clinic room.
I agree.
So that is that finding that harmony, and it's absent. That's the whole point of the unified approach, is that that we are not training and don't have readily available laws, lifespan developmental pathways, and phenomenological experiences of being, languages that afford then a readily available transjectivity that when we place in the adaptive structure, adaptive maladaptive pattern structure that we clinicians need to be able to do, ultimately do our work, is not available, or at least hasn't been available, but it can be available. And if we have availability there, that's going to be a game changer.
But I agree. And I think this
Yep.
is the key phenomena. And I want to zero in on it, both for the particular project, but for also this proposal. That's deeply analogous to Aristotle's integration of Sophia and phronesis, right?
So
Totally.
There's a proposal here for a key move that is the instantiation of wisdom in a very strong sense.
Totally.
I propose to you that individuals who can generalize that, who can in general map fluently between the phronesis of causal pathways and the Sophia of causal laws, are going to be much more capable of flourishing in general.
So I'll just say the two sides of the tree are mapped by two being. One is the being of Sophia. That's the left side. That's your theoretical B. Yeah. And then the other B is the B of phronesis. That's the pragmatic B. The unified theory, unified approach exactly maps that Aristotelian metaphor, right, through the garden of B and the being process of B of Sophia and B of phronesis. And the embodiment then of the capacity of the theoretical structure then to enter into the pragmatic world, and that iterative process successfully and coherently is wisdom.
That's great. So then I am picking up on something well, which means
like totally
how do you do it?
Architecture.
How did you do it?
yeah, so let me
No. How did you do it? Like you did it.
Right.
That's not in question. And that it's an instantiation of wisdom is not in question. How did you do it?
So in this particular case, okay, I have a basic formulaic architecture in which I hear trait-based dispositions.
Yeah.
Okay. I put those trait-based dispositions into a character adaptation formulation. Character adaptation is the recursive relevance in context.
Right.
I then back the character adaptation relevance recursive through the vector of physiology into genetics. I back it into a hypothetical developmental pathway, and I place it in a Bronfenbrenner socioecological context. And then I structure that and then imagine myself as the person living their lives in relationship to their parents, in relationship to their boyfriend, in relationship to this developmental stance, and think about their systems of justification at the person cultural level, right, and their systems of experience at the animal level, and their relational influences at the primate level. And I drop myself into that field and become that person.
So the imaginal is playing a very important role in this process.
Oh, totally. It's an immediate imaginal construction in relationship to all of that I would then bring to the individual. And I actually, building off of Rogers, I call my approach directive empathy. I will create my imaginal structure and then welcomely drop it into their structure and see if their ego self harmonizes. And if it does, now all of a sudden we'll start to resonate with a particular language to create a participatory dynamic that affords us clarity about these issues and a shared language.
That was helpful, Greg. That was very helpful. Thank you.
So the interesting bit about the imagination there, actually, because I could very much sympathize with that actually, is that the process of individualizing these kinds of, let's say, nomothetic findings about a person's personality trait scores is that you, at least for me, I don't start with the traits themselves. I don't prioritize the trait measures over what they say, nor under what they say. I use them in tandem, in parallel with one another. But I started with their experience, or rather their descriptions of their experience. So the first thing I ask is, what's going on? Tell me about what's going on. And I think this is me reiterating a point that I'd made in an earlier episode, but what usually brings patients to the clinic room isn't that they've had a single bad day, but a whole chain or sequence of bad days.
Yes.
And there's something non-arbitrary about the chain of bad days that has led them to the clinic room. And the question is, well, what's thematic about everything that's been happening that's led them to coming to seek psychotherapy? And the interesting hypothesis here is that if traits are measures of long-term patterns taking place within a person, let's say, in terms of their behavior, cognition, emotion, motivation, et cetera, and if the kinds of problems that lead people to seek psychotherapy take place over longer time scales, right? They're patterns stretching across longer spans of time, then you should be able to use one to make sense of the other. You should be able to use, right, descriptions that patients have of their problems, of what's bothering them, and descriptions of their traits from the Big Five point of view to sort of reciprocally reveal what's going on at the level of patterns, at the level of, right, style. And in this case, right, you ask them, give me, okay, so you're feeling anxious, you're struggling with anxiety. Give me 2 to 3 examples of times when you struggled with anxiety. Tell me, what was happening exactly? Were you alone? Were you with others? Were you at your job, or were you at home? What was happening? Tell me the details. Make it so that I get a strong, detailed, rich impression of the situation and the experience, as though I was there myself, seeing it and witnessing it. And then you collect 2 to 3 examples. Let's say you write them down word for word. Then you look over the transcript. If you don't want to be a good listener in the process itself, you look over the transcript and you try to catch, right, what themes are emerging in the examples from the trait perspective. Where's neuroticism finding life in this lived example? Where's extraversion, or the lack thereof, finding life? Where's conscientiousness? Where's openness? And then you start to get there's a kind of impression that emerges of the dynamic of the traits as styles that are being enacted in the person's examples. Then you can only make claims about what's happening in the examples as styles if it's related in their traits, because traits are what measure the long-term patterns that take place, right? You're paying attention to traits, not states so much, although states could also be relevant there. And then you come back to the clinic room and let them know, in light of what you told me, the assessment that you completed with the Big Five, let's say, we have evidence to suggest that you have such and such a style of relating to others at times of stress, or relating to the future, or to your own self, to your embodiment, or to the past, anything really. And that's the hermeneutical circulation, I would say, that sort of I undertake when trying to bridge the first person and third person perspectives, coming at it from the inside out and the outside in. So
you're doing reciprocal reconstruction, and Gregg's doing something similar, and then there's the imaginal in both. So this is very helpful. I think this is very helpful. I like trying to tease out, but I again, how do you know when you're doing it well versus when you're screwing it up?
Right. A couple of things I would say, Garri. One of the things that we can maybe talk about is from a UTalk perspective, we may be missing a step. Okay. And that is the step from these dispositional patterns that are, as we talk about, are actually enactments across a wide variety of different domains. They're human mental behavioral patterns, which means they're person environment patterns. Okay. And the big five people, Costa and McRae, they actually think of the traits in essentialist internal terms. And I actually think that's a mistake. Right? So I don't think we should think about traits as purely essentialist characteristics of the individual, but they are dispositional agent arena relational patterns, of which the person is constant, that we can then track, and we can see that the person does tend to generate them, but that doesn't make it essentialist inside the individual. And it's the case that, remember, we talked about the lexical hypothesis. The lexical hypothesis is the origin of these. And so the actual mechanistic instantiation of the theoretical formulation of these traits, okay, meaning if we're going to make some kind of essentialistic structural functional claims inside the individual about what these traits are, there's actually an enormous amount of theoretical work that needs to be done to go from, extraversion, okay, into an embodiment of a character adaptation system that demonstrates this distributed pattern, okay? So for me, what I'm doing, all right, when I see extraversion, I'm seeing the positive affect system on the one hand, also as its primary structure, positive affect system, which is basically sensitivity to reward, and the energetics of the focus on what's available in the environment, primarily at the animal level. And then that also then goes up into the social gregariousness at the primate level, okay? So there's a dispositional line that affords me clarity of the underlying structure of the animal into primate, the extraversion. Neuroticism, okay, neuroticism is the animalistic structure to detect threat and idle at negative affect reactivity, okay? And then it's also then going to set the stage for capturing the flavor and content of justification, okay? And the process by which that dynamic happens gives rise to self-consciousness, private self-consciousness, and especially private self-consciousness is vulnerable to a self-critic relation, which is an ego self relation, meaning the felt sense of anxiety on the one hand, and then the person embodiment of that. And if we look at the facets, of anxiety, of neuroticism, what you see is depression, anxiety, general distress. You see vulnerability to shame and guilt on the one hand, impulsive irritability on the other. The matrix actually maps these, because these are actually the self-other dimensions, as opposed to there's the animal and then there's the primate. And then it's the way it captures the person dimension and internalizes the introject critic of the ego on top of the self, okay? And neuroticism is this then tendency for negative affect system to be animalistically oriented toward threat, primate oriented towards loss of influence and either blame self or blame other, okay? And then it tends to capture the justificatory system and create an internalized self-critic. And those are the facets that you see in the big five, okay? Now notice what I've done here is I've taken this, neuroticism, okay, but then becomes this very generalist, essentialist structure. And now I've placed mid-level concepts in neuroticism that then can be placed inside a character that then afford me the capacity to go to state systems and be like, this is why this person is experiencing this state after they failed this test and then they pissed with their mom and then all of a sudden they went home and ruminated, okay? And I could see why this dispositional pattern would emerge across time and thus be picked up by the variable aggregates. And at the same time, it affords me this developmental life history and the capacity to drop into this self-ego relationship and empathize with the person. So you felt really negative, and then you felt negative about feeling negative, and then you got in this loop where you were stressed and then pissed at yourself for feeling stressed, and that just left you more stressed. You almost got into a panic attack, right? And people and then they say, yeah, that's exactly what fucking happened to me. That's how you know. The system will say, yeah, that's exactly right. How did you actually know that? And now you're dancing with them because what you did by listening to this as a psychological doctor, you afforded their ego an enormous amount of sense making that resonated with relevant information and afforded insight to then start to harmonize the variation that was coming at them as a very complex and chaotic set of variables that they couldn't gain control over. And now they start to harmonize and see music through the noise of their experience.
So the dimension I see you adding, it's a Platonic dimension, right? The levels of the psyche, and bringing the relationship between the levels of the psyche and to add a third dimension. So Garri was doing this reciprocal reconstruction this way, and you're saying that's good, but you need to do it at these levels because the different levels of the psyche are also in these reciprocal relationships with each other. Is that a fair?
100%, right. And then if you do recursive relevance realization, scale and variant modeling across that structure, you can then specify the different, and it's crucial because they're actually operating at different time frames, by the way. Okay, the animals operate at the person time frame, and they also have different fundamental phenomenological set points. Like the person narrating ego is different than the experiential self, which is different than the embodiment of somatic processes.
But what I saw you doing, and it was weird in a wonderful way, right? Is that, and this is, and I mean this is a compliment, this is very Platonic. You were actually imaginally reenacting, right, the deep continuity and the emergence, right? And then you were bringing that in as a way of refining the reciprocal reconstruction between, right, the events, the narrative events, and right, the big five trait. That's what I saw you doing. Is that
It's exactly
fair?
right. Exactly right.
First of all, that's beautifully Platonic. But I have one question for both of you still, because there's a thing that's still hanging in my mind, which is, right, I see how you're both moving this off an essentialist framework. You're talking about coupling dynamics this way, coupling dynamics that way. I think this is deeply right. But what I'm not hearing is, if this is actually transjective, I also need, I assume that you need a good description of the environment as well, because if it's a transjective relation, it's being co-created by the inner dynamics that you two are talking about, but also how is the environment unfolding? What's the dynamics of the environment?
Well, I'll say, John, this is one of the great challenges of being a clinician.
Right.
Okay. So what you have access to is the reconstructed episodes placed in the context of what brings you here as a problem. Okay. And then you have to situate yourself in their recursive relevance realization self-world modeling as what you have access to through the justificatory narrative of both how you translate it into language and how you filter it, what they actually tell you. If they have obsessive sexual fetishes that they don't actually share, and you're like, oh, fuck, if I knew that, no pun intended, if I knew that, then this would actually, I understand the phenomenology a lot better if you're hiding this big chunk of your psyche. So not only do we actually not know what the mother really is saying, but rather have an episodic reconstruction of it, there's also the filtering of what they actually tell you. And so you're unbelievably impoverished, and people fail this all the time, clinicians, as far as I'm concerned. They fail to know how little they don't know about the actual environment. Right. And they just reconstruct the presumption that what the person telling them is actual. If anyone else saw it, though, or many other people, it's like, that's not what happened. I mean, talk to couples, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, you talk to a couple, you're like, oh, your husband is like, God, that wife's kind of a bitch. And you talk to the wife, and you're like, oh, Jesus, he was an asshole. You know, you're like, it's like, no, it's a totally different structure. So the awareness of the environment's unbelievable. You get an impoverishment of that. And then part of the skill then is dropping yourself into the empathetic structure, understanding what the person's aspectualizing, and then the dispositional tendencies by which they aspectualize, and then try to infer what the environment looks like based on that filtering process.
Right.
What the environment looks like as a world.
As a world to them.
Exactly.
And of course, it is the awareness structure that they operate to. You know, like I'll give you just one career example. One of the most successful cases I had, I may have talked about her, but it was one of the most. So she has an avoidant structure, unbelievable shame-based depression. I'm a horrible piece of shit. This is horrible. My life's gone total reciprocal narrating, and the world's unpredictable, nightmarish, and I'm unbelievably disastrous. And an avoidant personality structure if we get into attachment. Okay, she runs away immediately, sees the world as threat. She describes her mom in the way she uses. She says, "Oh, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am." Okay, so I'm at, like I asked for a conversation. Well, it's like, well, we hung up, and I told her, you know, I'll talk to you tomorrow, ma'am. It's like, wait a minute, you said ma'am to your mom. She's like, yeah. I was like, huh, that's interesting, right? That's diagnostic. And then the whole issue is, well, my mom can get really mad, and she gets this and this. So how authoritarian is mom? Okay, I have no idea. And indeed, when I actually meet mom, she's clueless. That her daughter's weird, and daughter's super sensitive, and mom then just has her own avoidant structure and doesn't really know how to talk to her at all. Daughter interprets this as distant cruelness. Right. Mom is simply clueless, you know? So now you had no idea. When I actually met with her, mom's pretty warm. And if you're, quote, normal and she can read you, she's actually really engaged. But she tries to read her sister, her daughter's like super sensitive. Mom does clueless about it. So she just backs off and says, I wish we could talk more, but I guess we can't. So I'm leaving. Daughter's like, see, she doesn't care about me at all. So I'll call her ma'am as a distancing function. I would never have known unless I actually talked with her, whether mom, you know, you could hypothesize her whole avoidance sensitivity is a function of mom's cruelty. No, that wasn't the case at all. It was actually started in the daughter's head, basically.
Wow. So
it's a tough question, John.
Yeah, right.
It gives requires us clinicians to generate a lot of thought if we're thoughtful about it.
Is there a possible, is there a plausible presumption that because they're coming in, there is some mismatch between them and their environment? I mean, that or
almost by definition. I mean, if we
Yeah.
define these as entrenched maladaptive patterns and we put them in transjective terms because the ontology of problems are exactly that, then
Yeah.
yes, listen, there are definitely people. I mean, think about Alzheimer's disease as I use a classic example of mental disease. Obviously, the system can break on the inside, and really, no matter what the environment, if it's that bad,
granted,
you're done,
yeah.
right? And so you can see certain contexts of psychotic breaks and other things are sort of like, I don't care what's happening, the system broke, and the system's going to then dysfunction. But the vast majority of what I deal with internalizing neurotic conditions, okay, in psychotherapy, and what's amenable to psychotherapy is it precisely the person environment transjective relation over time. And the fact that there is a mismatch by which the person's adjusting to the environment that then constrains them. That's what a triple negative neurotic loop is. Bad shit happens in the environment. They get negative feelings about that. And rather than the system being able to hold it in a curious, accepting, loving, motivated toward valued state of being, which is the COM-MO flashlight, what happens is they get avoiding, they get controlling, they get critical, they get attacking. And that ultimately creates an enormous amount of constraints and then creates the vicious environment person feedback loop that then creates fires after fires that they keep trying to put out with more defensive oil, which spreads the fires into more disasters. And then you call in a psychological doctor and try to put some constraints on it so the system stops burning.
Okay, so I won't press this anymore, but I'm finding that this seems to me to be like one of the places where artistry is going to make a big difference in the practice, because you're kind of shadowboxing with the environment rather than getting a direct pun intended, by the way, right? And that's really intriguing. But I guess I do want to, because of time, I would like to return. Return back. I mean, but thank you for this interlude, because it was helpful for me, because the space that Garri carved out, and then the two of you are resonating in this space between, right, laws, what I was calling laws and pathways, causal laws and causal pathways, and how you're negotiating that was extremely interesting and important.
I really like that differentiation. Very helpful for me too. Okay, but I'll shut up.
Well, yeah, I will too, because I know Garri was setting this up to make a transition to the next big argument, which is to try to do something similar with triple R and attachment theory, which is another very powerful theory. Just as an anecdote, there's a friend of mine, psychiatrist, and they were at a conference, and the confidence some of these people are placing in attachment theory was almost imperialistic, like claiming that autism could be totally explained in terms of avoidant attachment. And I was like, whoa. So I think that's overreach, but overreach at least points to the fact that people have some justified confidence in the underlying theory, and attachment theory does have quite a bit of empirical backing and theoretical explanation, two good hallmarks of a good theory.
Yeah, so let's transition into attachment theory at this point, but first by wrapping up what we've covered with in trait theory. So the main point here has been that each of the 5 traits has its own kind of normativity. Yes. And we covered what these normativities were in relatively broad terms, and then we specified what they might look like by going through the vignette that we did. Yes. Taking an outside-in perspective with the big 5 and seeing how individual differences as measured by traits can find life in the lived experiences that patients, hypothetical or not, bring to the clinic room, and that there's a continuity there that can be sort of capitalized on, that should be capitalized on, in fact, by clinicians to make better sense of the ways in which the agent arena relationship has been breaking down for people. So if we go up from the level of traits back to the level of meta traits, we have stability and plasticity. And essentially the optimal grouping that's taking place at the meta trait level is between how to, on the one hand, accommodate the environment, right? That's motivated by exploration, by plasticity, while on the other hand, how to assimilate the environment to to my needs, essentially, which is motivated by a kind of security-based, right, stability dynamic. And so we get into an interesting kind of terrain now, because the claim here is that meta-trait stability functions to promote security-seeking behaviors or patterns of enactment. And meta-trait plasticity tends to promote exploratory forms of enactment. And now we've got a basic dynamic between security and exploration going. Now, this is the very dynamic that we see taking place in attachment formation, and such that individual differences in styles of attachment are essentially indicative of or predictive of differences of how people navigate or negotiate the trade-off between security and exploration in the context of relationships, both in relation to familiars and unfamiliars.
Yep.
So let's begin with attachment theory now, setting up the stage for next time. And maybe I'll just go over some of the basic principles and what Bowlby, who was the creator of attachment theory in the, I think it was the 40s, Gregg, 40s, 50s.
It's a little, yeah, he starts getting interested in that. I think it starts really making its impact in the 50s to 60s. But yeah, coming on the heels of World War II.
Ainsworth doesn't do her stuff until what, the 80s?
70s.
70s?
Late, I think Ainsworth late 70s into 80s.
Early 80s kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so Bowlby and Ainsworth are really the two faces of attachment theory. Ainsworth took Bowlby's paradigm and then popularized, or took Bowlby's theory and then set it up into a paradigm of studying and determining attachment styles in infants. So the entire point of it is, so let's go through a kind of story here, all right? Why did Bowlby do what he did? Why was he interested in what he was interested in? So his approach drew on findings from evolutionary biology, from ethology, from observational data on human neonates with their caregivers, and control theory, which is an important but neglected one, actually. I remember studying attachment theory in undergrad, and control theory wasn't covered at all.
Good point, Garri. Very good point. Yes.
So his theoretical framework plugs right into dynamical and developmental systems theory, and dynamical approaches to cognition and embodiment and things like that, which is essentially what we're going to capitalize on in the next episode. Now, Bowlby was also deeply influenced by Freudian ways of looking at pathology. And so the Freudian way really was that, right, a patient comes in and sooner or later you uncover these unresolved conflicts and that are at the source of what's going wrong in the patient's life. And then you sort of, right, in retrospect, in hindsight, make the claim that these conflicts have their origin in the person's early developmental history. So something went terribly wrong in their early development, in their childhood, in their relationship with their parents. Now, as true, let's say, as such a claim might be, there's no way to really make it scientific because it's not quite testable. You can't test what happened in the past, in the present, obviously. What Bowlby tried to do, or one of the contributions of the Bowlby approach, was to precisely set up the Freudian sort of logic in a scientific context where these kinds of claims could be tested. And so the idea was that depending on the kinds of patterns of relating that infants get into with their caregivers in the first few years of life, that's going to determine the kind of style of relating that the infant will have to people in general, right? That'll follow them well into adulthood, such that we now know that in all sorts of different cases of severe psychopathology, different attachment disturbances are implicated. So what Bowlby and then later Ainsworth did was they measured different types of attachment styles and ended up labeling some as insecure, right? As deviating from the normative development of the normal adult, let's say.
Normative in a statistical sense there. Right? Isn't that what you
I
meant?
think there was also an axiological sense.
Yeah, so we got to be
Right there.
careful about that. I wanted to be very,
Right, we should be clear when we're meeting one versus the other.
and the fact that I think in attachment theory, they are blended, sometimes legitimately and sometimes equivocally. And so I think we
I
gotta
totally
be-
agree with that, suspect.
Yeah,
John.
we got to be really, really careful. I'm sorry, I'm not attributing any error to you, Garri. I'm just saying, like, when we're reflecting on this, because I'm thinking of people that are big now, like Sue Johnson and others, right, and like I said, that imperialism that I just mentioned is a slippage, I think, between the two senses of normative in a way that is not being properly addressed. I just wanted to flag that again, and then sorry, please keep going.
No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We should actually flag that, just as you did, to get back to it afterwards, because this is one of the critiques that I would like to level against the sort of classical typology of attachment styles that attachment theory has, which labels different attachment styles as secure or insecure. Whereas what I will want to argue for is that what's more appropriate is adaptive versus non-adaptive or maladaptive attachment style, which allows for room for the context sensitivity, whereby context involves or entails also cultural differences and how the kinds of attachment styles that are valued and the ways in which cultures organize themselves and individuals in their groups, such that if you're, I mean, this is one of the things, right, that people experience with culture shock. If somebody comes from a very collectivistic, let's say, sort of culture where, it's like people like to be and tend to be in each other's faces and in each other's business and things like that, right? They come to a more individualistic society, and it's like, you're too much, man. Like, keep your distance. There's more of an emphasis on avoidance. And you can't say that the way in which the person was necessarily maladaptive prior to coming to this new culture. Right. So we have to make room for that as well in our conceptualization of attachments and the adaptivity of attachment styles.
Yeah.
So
no, that makes sense.
I think that's an excellent point. I think that's an excellent point. So just keep going, Garri.
Yeah, I'll go for about 4 or 5 more minutes, and then I'll stop there just to set us up. Yep. So the story goes something like this. What is attachment to begin with? Well, if we look at human beings, we see immediately that there's a significant and almost fundamental difference between human infants, neonates, and non-human infants in the animal kingdom. Human infants have the longest dependency period of all neonates ever, right? Whereas in the first several weeks, you have, like, I don't know, a calf that's been born, able to walk around and then fulfill its basic biological functions. Human beings, right? Human infants are, John, I'm going to quote something you said like 10 years ago at a conference that has stuck with me since, right? Human babies are useless, right? And it's like, if you give them enough love, then they become persons.
Yes.
Right. That's the magical thing. And this is also
you should put that on a bumper sticker, right, John?
Yeah.
Wait till you hear the next part, actually, of what John said, that it's like looking at your couch long enough until it becomes a Porsche.
Right.
Right. It's this magical leap, right? Human infants are dependent. They require attention and care and consistent care, sustained care over long periods of time in order to develop into effective, mature, adaptive adults. Mm-hmm. So why is this? So how does this relate to attachment? Well, when you're completely helpless as you are as a human infant, then you can't do anything for yourself. You can't even hold your neck up. Mm-hmm. And you need, right? If there's physical separation between you and your caregiver and something goes wrong, you're done. So the attachment system, according to Bowlby, evolved as an adaptation to maintaining proximity, physical proximity between infant and caregiver until infant becomes relatively, incrementally more independent and individuated. And so
Can I interrupt here for 1 second? I mean, I just want to make clear that that's like how integral this is to our cognition. Our cognition depends on at least these two things, right? Much, much more, but at least these two, that we're bipedal and we have big brains, right? And the problem with that design is like it puts tremendous pressure on female morphology, right? You want to open the hips up to open up the birth canal. The problem is, as you do this, you make bipedalism almost impossible because you'll create a waddle. So evolution's solution was, right, widen the female pelvis a bit, right, and then push the baby through at the brink of destruction of both the baby and the mother, right, and with only 40% of its brain development having been complete. And so the baby is as minimally viable as possible. It actually has a minority of its brain, and all of this has to take place outside of it. And so, right, so some of the things that are constitutive of our ability to be the kind of, like, think about Gregg's point about the mobility of the organism and the bipedalism and the big things that are constitutive of our embodied cognition are necessarily bound up with attachment.
Nice.
And I think Clifford Geertz actually made the argument here that, right, the value of being born prematurely like that. So the cost, first of all, is that you lose a lot of instinctive capacities and functions.
Exactly.
The value of that is that you get to learn a lot more and you get enhanced plasticity,
yes,
neonatally.
Yeah.
And his argument was that culture, distributed cognition, culture that comes in to fill that gap.
Yes, I think that's totally right.
Yep.
So neontony is an exactive strategy. And one of the ways you can play with the evolvability of your species, as opposed to the evolution of trait, is by playing around with neontony.
And so linking this back to the big five theory of personality, especially the two meta traits. Now, on the one hand, as you're developing as an infant, you got to stay close to your caregiver, close enough to your caregiver to have sufficient security, right?
Yes.
Against right, predators or accidents that might happen that might seriously harm you or kill you. So there's a strong demand for security that's mediated by proximity to the caregiver.
Right.
On the other hand, unless you expose yourself to novelty, then you're not going to be able to capitalize and make the most of the plasticity that you have, the capacity for learning that's really distinctly and uniquely human. And so you gotta optimally grip between the two. Right. And what you see across development happening is there's a lot of dependency at first, not so much exploration, and then the ratio changes. It becomes much more tilted towards exploration and less so towards security in the normal cases, in the statistical sense.
Right.
Now, unless you explore, right, and engage in exploratory modes of behavior and interaction with the world, then you're not going to be able to fare well against the unknown. And the problem with the unknown is that it's irreducible. So you have no choice but to deal with it. And so if you don't grow and cultivate these capacities, right, for exploration, then you're going to be at a kind of disadvantage relative to someone who has. And
one way of saying it is, like you said, Geertz, our big advantage is we can plug in culture, but culture requires exploration.
Yep.
Right. It requires exploration. It demands plasticity.
Yep. So now we've got this dynamic between exploration and security being played off in attachment formation. And in attachment formation. And that's the thematic continuity that I really want to pick up on between the big five meta traits of stability and plasticity and these two basic motives that we see playing out in attachment. And if we do that well, then we can integrate the big five theory of personality conceptually with attachment theory, thereby producing a more comprehensive account of human personality that involves not just the structural functional aspects as described by the five-factor model, right? The various traits and the trait hierarchy, but also the developmental aspects as described by attachment theory.
That's excellent. And
So-
and Triple R is doing a significant mediating role in that right there. I
Lovely.
think we should close it here. I think that was a beautiful
Very
place
good.
to close. And so what we'll do next time is Garri will be center stage again. We'll see how much time. Gregg might come back also to be center stage. We'll see if we split it or how much we need. But we'll first of all do this attachment, like Garri said, trying to integrate the structural functional with the developmental, right, through the shared dynamics of recursive relevance realization. And then once we're doing that, and why Gregg will come back center stages, how does all of that then fit in with Gregg's very comprehensive onto and phylogenetic model that he's actually, again, making use of today so valuably. I was deeply impressed by how Gregg was able to translate, and I don't use this word pejoratively. People who know me know I don't, an abstract theoretical framework into an imaginal enactment that gave him such finesse in the hermeneutics within therapy. That was, I mean, for me, that was like a gem moment. We were here, and then Gregg's overarching argument was fantastic. So next time, sorry, Garri's overarching argument was fantastic. Really, really good.
Yes. Lovely.
So that's my final word, and just let everybody know where we're going. Gregg and Garri, is there anything more either one of you want to say?
It was a blast. I feel attached to both of you guys.
Yeah, I guess this is a reflection of our healthy attachment relationships.
Right. I feel
with
both
another.
secure and look forward to exploring further.
Mhm. Exactly.
And it does bring out how these dynamics we were talking about intersect with, interafford, interpenetrate the dynamics of dialogos. So thank you very much for that, gentlemen.
Amen.
Thank you.